Welcome to Zain Khan Live, where everything is discussed and nothing is censored. Today we have with us a prominent British journalist, a researcher, Yvonne Ridley. We will be discussing her career, her life, and her important experiences. Welcome to our show, Yvonne Ridley. This is Zain Khan. It is such a pleasure having you on Zain Khan Live.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this.
I want to start by saying Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
I want to get to the first question, and it has always fascinated me, your story especially. You were caught up in Afghanistan, and then the Taliban caught you and you stayed there, and then you converted. I want our viewers to know your story. What happened?
Right. Well, I was arrested exactly 20 years ago today. In Afghanistan, I had sneaked in without a passport or visa. I was with a couple of guides and I was wanting to do a story about what life was like for ordinary people under the Taliban. They were ruling, they were in charge at the time. They didn't have control of the whole country like they do now, but they held most of it. And I went in, it was after the horrific events of 9/11, but before the war started. And so I got in and I was there for 2 days. And then unfortunately on September the 28th, I was rumbled, arrested for having entered the country illegally. They thought they'd caught some American GI Jane character, and it took some dissuading them that I was in fact British. They didn't recognize my accent, which is from the north of England. And I said, well, this is our tribal areas and we don't all talk like the Queen. There were some amusing anecdotes during my time, 6 days in Jalalabad, and then I was moved to Kabul for another 5 days before I was released. But during that time, I was terrified throughout because I had bought into the propaganda. This was the most brutal, evil regime in the world. They hated women. I am not going to survive this ordeal. And in fact, throughout the 11 days, they treated me with kindness and respect. I, in return, adopted the position of prisoner from hell. I spat at them, I swore at them, I threw things at them. I went on hunger strike. And all I wanted was that they either let me go or they kill me, because I didn't want any torture, rape, abuse. You know, as I say, I bought into all of the Western propaganda. So I maintained this position of Mrs. Angry, and they kept saying to me, why are you behaving like this? You are our guest. We want you to be happy. And on the 6th day, I was invited to embrace Islam, and I saw this as an opportunity to get out. I said, I can't make such a life-changing decision while I'm in prison, but if you let me go, I promise I will read your holy book, I will study Islam. They held on to quite a few other Westerners, but they released me. And when I got back to London, I started reading the Quran. Yes, it was the fulfillment of a promise, but at the same time, as a journalist covering the Middle East and Asia and the Muslim world, I realized that if I was to know anything about the people, then I needed to know about the faith, because during those 11 days with the Taliban, I realized that their faith was something more than they just picked up and put down on a Friday. it was 24/7. It was the way they ate, the way they slept, the way they dressed. When they entered a room, they would say Bismillah, just everything in their life seemed to be guided or revolved around Islam. So I set about reading the Quran. I was a practicing Christian, so I understood the English translation very well. I recognized all of the prophets, with the exception of Muhammad. I hadn't heard about him before. And I was really impressed by what I was reading. And so very soon, what had set out as an academic exercise turned into a spiritual journey for me. And 2 years later, I embraced Islam and joined what I call the biggest and the best family in the world. Not a popular choice for some people. The reaction was astounding. Some people, friends, or I thought they were friends, just walked away from me. It was a very challenging time.
What about their behavior? Did anything about the Taliban's behavior influence you towards accepting Islam or studying Islam? Or was it just your promise that you made that if I get out of Afghanistan, I'm going to study this?
No, it was just the promise I made, although I think that the Taliban might try and claim me as one of theirs now. It was very much a decision that I came to on my own, and I was influenced by all sorts of Muslims. Because of my high profile and sort of celebrity status at that point, I had access to some amazing scholars, from the very conservative with a small c right up to quite liberal scholars. And what I did, as soon as I came across a dilemma or something that I didn't understand, I would call or contact about 4 or 5 of these scholars, hear all of their discussions, and then make my own conclusion.
Now, you were talking about how your family and friends reacted when you accepted Islam. Tell us a little more about Islamophobia. Tell us about your hard times. Did you face any Islamophobia in your career, around you?
Yes, I did. And of course, Islamophobia is a form of racism. Now then, as a person of white privilege, I never expected to experience racism. But once I embraced Islam and put on the hijab, it was the hijab that started it. Once I put on the hijab, I was immediately propelled into the front lines, short sword fighting in defense of Islam. There's no other way to describe it. And I have been threatened, abused. I've been told, why don't you go back home? The UK is my home. I've never known anywhere else. But this was the sort of reaction that I got going into a restaurant with my friends. The waiter will take down the orders, and then he would come to me, and then he would turn around to others and say, so what does she want? As though I was suddenly struck deaf and dumb. It was the reaction to people. It has been quite startling. And there will be lots of your viewers saying, well, welcome to our world. And it really is quite challenging, because quite often you can't see the racism, you can't hear it. It's there, but you can't quite put your finger on it. And and then you suspect it, and then you think that maybe you're imagining things. So it has opened up quite a different attitude in me. And then especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, when people of color or Black people say that they have been racially abused, I tend to believe them. It's not something imaginary. It's very, you might not be able to put your finger on it, but it's tangible.
Now, while the whole ISIS thing was happening in Syria, I was following your tweets and you were doing a lot of research on that whole subject. I want to ask you a question, and this might be a technical and an academic question. What are the technical differences between that group in ISIS that used to be there and the Taliban that were always in Afghanistan?
Well, it's apples and pears. You know, they are quite different. ISIS, although they've got Islam in their title, ISIS in Syria, Iraq, and ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan are nothing like the Taliban. They introduced slave trades, rape gangs, behavior that was wholly un-Islamic, such as torture, defiling bodies, corpses. Their behavior has been absolutely off the scale, extreme, and they also aren't, I would say, practicing Muslims, because they wouldn't have done any of this if they were. Now, the Taliban are conservative with a small c, but they're also very puritanical. And this question of rape gangs and what happened to the Yazidi women, I know personally repulsed them. They were absolutely shocked. The slave markets of Raqqa, all of this was quite shocking, anathema to the Taliban. And they, as I said before, they are conservative with a small c. I think that most of their influence is Deobandi, and they couldn't be more different. Now, in May, ISIS Khorasan blew up a girls' school in Kabul. It was in the Hazara quarter, and they killed 90 schoolgirls. And the Taliban condemned that behavior and were quite outraged by it. So they have absolutely nothing in common with ISIS. They want to get rid of ISIS from Afghanistan. They see them very much as a stain on the country. So I would say that there is nothing in common. In fact, I think that ISIS Khorasan have said that the Taliban are apostates, and the usual insults, which are quite shocking. And there's certainly no link between them, and nor could I ever, and you should never say never, but I cannot see a situation come to pass where they would ever work together.
You've been to Afghanistan, you've witnessed the Taliban back in the day. I was talking to another journalist just about a few days ago, and he said that it was mocking for people to say that it was actually Pakistan who supported the Taliban coming back into power in Kabul. My friend was saying that, the journalist friend, that the Taliban had all the means to take over Kabul on their own. So I want to ask a broad question, and I want your analysis on it. Obviously, you are a journalist, a prominent journalist. Do you think the Pakistan supports the Taliban, like arming them and things like that recently?
Well, I think that Pakistan has supported the Taliban. Now, whether they've supported, I'm not sure that they've supported them with weapons. I don't think so, but there is other way of giving material support, looking after wounded, helping those that have been injured, and providing maybe a safe haven. This is purely speculative on my part. I've no concrete evidence of this, but I think too many indicators point to the fact that Pakistan may have given some form of support to the Taliban. Whatever the truth of that is, they are neighbours, and it is in Pakistan's interest to have at least one peaceful border, and that massive, long, porous border with Afghanistan means that apart from obviously being trading neighbours, if there are problems of instability in Afghanistan, it will impact Pakistan. Pakistan has enough problems with its other border with India and Kashmir. And so it really isn't in Pakistan's self-interests to have any hostilities with Afghanistan. So if indeed they had helped the Taliban, which I suspect they did, they were probably doing it out of self-interest rather than trying to stir the pot against the international community. Whatever the truth of it is, the Taliban would still have succeeded, because for the last 20 years, they've been out of power. They have been able to reflect and think and contemplate about the mistakes that they made when they were in power. And they have spent quite an amount of time working a hearts and minds campaign on rural Afghanistan, which is about 70% of the Afghan population. And while the Afghan elite have been enjoying the benefits of the corrupt Ashraf Ghani government, the poor and working classes in rural Afghanistan have not benefited at all. And so it's hardly surprising that they have gravitated towards the Taliban. And the Taliban haven't suddenly been thrust into power. They have been ruling parts of Afghanistan since about 2009, 2010. They've been running parallel governments. They've been raising taxes. They have been holding their own courts. And when poor people have wanted justice, they haven't gone to the Ashraf Ghani because it's full of corruption. They have instead gone to the Taliban in the area, and their justice has been swift and exacting and fair. So all of this has been going on for more than a decade. Why haven't we heard about it? Because journalists have been focusing, Western journalists have been focusing their energies in Kabul. They don't travel outside of Kabul, or very rarely. If they are traveling, they're in heavily protected convoys. And so you don't tend to get to see what's going on in rural Afghanistan. And this is something that I have seen, because I have been back to Afghanistan a few times, and I have usually come in through Pakistan undetected through the border, because it's less fuss and I'm able to move around more freely. So I have spoken to these people. So for me, it wasn't really a surprise that the Taliban took power. And last February in Doha, there was the Doha Agreement, peace deal that was signed between the Americans and the Taliban. Now, if that didn't send a signal directly to the Ashraf Ghani government that, they better wake up and shake up, then nothing would. So I, for one, was not at all surprised at the rapid sort of military march to victory of the Taliban when it happened, because they had put everything in place. So it wasn't a surprise to me, and I doubt for many of the ministers who stuffed their pockets with the money of the Afghan people, it wasn't a surprise to them, because when they departed, they took a lot of wealth with them.
You just spoke about India in your last reply. I want your geopolitical analysis. Since the Taliban took government in Afghanistan, India seems to have been using extremely undiplomatic language. What is India trying to achieve? And do you see friction between Afghanistan and India in the coming months or years? Because I don't think they would be getting along. But how do you see it?
Well, you just have to read the headlines in the Indian media to realize that India has a huge problem with the Taliban. And there are people out there who are able to follow and do analysis on the social networks, on chatter groups, and they have detected tens of thousands of false accounts tweeting and retweeting anti-Taliban propaganda coming from India. Now, I have, since the Taliban came to power, I have received photoshopped photographs alleging to show Taliban brutality, but the photographs have been photoshopped. We saw video footage of a helicopter with a man dangling on the end of a rope. But when you see extended footage of that, it is a man who is replacing some flags on very high up buildings, and he's actually waving and smiling on the end of this rope as he's doing it. But this was heavily edited, and here is a victim of the Taliban being hung, and really juvenile responses that have come out of India. Now you have to look at at Afghanistan as a whole. The Taliban, while they've done their hearts and minds inside Afghanistan, they have also been astute enough to realize that this time they need the international community behind them, not least of all for trade. And so they have gone round the neighborhood to do business. I'm sure that trade talks have already taken place between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Trade talks have happened with Iran. Now, the Taliban have said there's
also China.
Yes, but with Iran, it's important this, because who hates Iran? Israel. Israel is fighting a shadow war with Iran in the Persian Gulf. And India is very friendly as a nuclear power with Israel. So Israel, India do not want to see a stable Afghanistan. because the Taliban are opening trade talks with Iran. So, but you're right, they've also been talking with China, with Russia, with their immediate neighbors. Obviously, Qatar is supporting them, Qatar being the place that hosted the original peace talks. The Turks are also involved. And it's quite clear that China wants to reinvigorate and reopen the old Silk Road route, trading route, of which Afghanistan and Pakistan are key components of that route.
They want to connect feedback to like the Central Asian states, and then they want the road to go through the Afghanistan.
That's right. And it's an inspired idea. From a trading point of view. So in whose interests is it? Well, obviously, all the countries in that trading route. It's in everyone's interests, you know, that they have a very productive, thriving trading route. And a stable Afghanistan means a stable Pakistan. A flourishing Afghanistan will have a spin-off effect on Pakistan. And a flourishing Pakistan is something that India does not want to see. So I think that everybody has to be on their guard to make sure that this stability is maintained. Unfortunately, at the moment, there is a looming crisis over cash because America has frozen the Afghan government's funds, much of which is invested in America or in American banks. And it means that Afghanistan right now is days away from financial economic collapse. Aid workers overseas aid workers aren't being paid because the NGOs can't send money because the banking network has been frozen. Friends in Kabul tell me that they have to queue for 6-7 hours to get to the cash point. And even when they do, it's either runs out of cash or they are only allowed a limited amount of money to take out.
Now the argument of the Americans is that, and I was reading a few headlines as well, Biden said that he wants an inclusive government in Afghanistan. And that's why they're putting these sort of sanctions and they've frozen the cash of Afghanistan. And some Democratic leaders, they're expecting women to take the lead role in Afghanistan under the Taliban. They want the LGBT community to be represented in Afghanistan. So do you see these things happening? People of color, LGBT, women taking lead in Afghanistan? Or do you think that the Taliban won't be able to be as inclusive as the Americans want them to be?
What LGBT community? There was no LGBT community under the Ashraf Ghani government. There were no gay clubs. There were, you know, this is an absolute nonsense. And the Americans are now starting to invent things. The LGBT community, yes, it exists in Afghanistan, but it exists underground because of Afghan culture. Now, this culture, the Taliban didn't bring in. This is culture that has been around for hundreds of years. So when people start talking about, oh, you know, now that the Taliban have arrived, there are no gay rights. And I'm saying, what gay rights were there before? And if Joe Biden was so concerned about the LGBT community, why didn't he show it last year? Why didn't he, you know, why didn't he raise it with the Ashraf Ghani government? It's an absolute nonsense to even suggest that there was a thriving LGBT community. The signs so far of no women in the interim government is disappointing, but I take heart from the fact that it is an interim government. I think given time, I mean, they've only been in power for 4 weeks, but given time, let's see their words turn into actions. Now, most governments, when they come to power, especially, will say, give us time. And it takes about 3 to 4 years before you see whether a government has kept its words, has honoured its agreements, has lived up to its manifesto.
Just as Joe Biden, he asks for a few more years before he fulfills his promises, right?
Yeah.
So we should be expecting the same from other governments as well.
Absolutely. And I think that, for Joe Biden to freeze the assets and government funds of Afghanistan, he's acting more like Uncle Joe Stalin than Uncle Joe Biden. It is, people will die. People will die because America is rolling out a spiteful, malicious financial strangulation of the Afghan economy for nothing more than the Taliban having this victory, crushing the greatest superpower in the world. They're absolutely furious, and they are now launching another war by stealth, but this time on the finances of the Afghan economy. And this will result in the deaths of tens of thousands of children. Children, they say they care so much about when talking about education, but they don't want to put food in their bellies. And the reality is those children will starve to death, and school will be the last thing on their minds if this economic strangulation continues. And Joe Biden will have blood on his hands, the blood of innocent Afghan children. It's a wicked thing, and Afghanistan is in a crisis situation. It's days away from collapse.
I want to get to a few last questions. I interviewed you in a conference happening in Pakistan regarding Aafia Siddiqui. What are your views on that? How do you see the future of Aafia Siddiqui since Joe Biden is in power right now and the Democrats are, in-house? What do you see the future of Aafia Siddiqui? Do you think that Pakistan and the United States would reach any conclusion?
It could be resolved tomorrow. All Biden has got to do is to pick up the phone to Imran Khan, which he hasn't even done since he became president in January. He could have easily picked up the phone, but he has to pick up the phone to Imran Khan and say, if you want this woman back, why don't you give us Dr. Afridi? And I think personally that would be a good deal. Dr. Afridi is a waste of space. He's a waste of Pakistani taxpayers' money. And, let him out, let him go back, let him go to America. I don't know if he's been there before, but let him go to America. He's of no use at all in prison. The Pakistan people aren't spiteful and vindictive. I can't imagine that anyone's getting any real pleasure out of this man being locked up. Send him to America if it means that they will release Aafia Siddiqui. And I am almost certain that they will release Aafia Siddiqui. I don't think she's of any value to them. In fact, if anything, she's a liability because she is seen as a rallying cause to all sorts of extreme groups, which, by the way, she wouldn't want in her name, but nevertheless, because she represents everything that was wrong about the never-ending war on terror, she has become a rallying point. So I would say, in fact, if Joe Biden won't call Imran Khan, let Imran Khan be the bigger person and ring Joe Biden and say, let's do a deal. You take this Dr. Afridi, you're welcome to him, but give us the daughter of our nation in return. It's as simple as that. It's a phone call. Go on, Imran, just do it.
I want to get to the last question. And speaking of Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan, you seem to know each other because when he was going to have a march to Waziristan, it was you who was accompanying him in that whole thing. How do you think Prime Minister Imran Khan is handling the Afghanistan situation?
I'm a big admirer of Imran Khan, and I think that he was a sporting legend, and I think he could become a political legend as well. He needs the support and patience of his people. He has a great vision for Pakistan. And right from day one, when I interviewed him before his party really became an integral part of the Pakistan political landscape, he had a great vision for Pakistan, a Pakistan that would not be reliant or subservient or servile to America. And it's not that he's anti-American or anti-Western. You know, he's got his sons, I think, are still living in Britain. He has, there is a mutual respect there. He's admired universally.
He has a lot of friends in Hollywood. So
yes, he's and he has a huge following, but he is not seduced by US dollars. Sadly, the same cannot be said of other Pakistan leaders who, like our former Prime Minister Tony Blair, have been happy to be America's lapdog. Imran Khan isn't. Now, taking on America like that can be quite difficult and quite challenging. But I think that he can turn Pakistan around and awake the sleeping giant that the country is. And I think that if this trade route idea comes into force, then Afghanistan and Pakistan will both benefit and will both flourish from it. And I think that they should be the supportive neighbours that each other needs. And I think that the one leader who can do this in Pakistan is Imran Khan, because he has this love for his nation, the love for his people, and a hatred of corruption. And I think he's the one person who can turn things round for Pakistan, and would be a great neighbour and a great ally for Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Yvonne Ridley, for being on Zain Khan Live. It was such a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
This was Yvonne Ridley, a prominent British journalist. We were discussing her experience with the Taliban, also her analysis about Afghanistan and Syria, and lastly, her opinions on Aafia Siddiqui. Until the next episode of Zain Khan Live, keep on watching Zain Khan Live. This is Zain Khan. Take care and goodbye.